Welcome to this lecturette on models of communication. In this lecturette, we'll be looking at how communication can be understood as transmission, exchange, meaning, and discourse. One thing we need to keep in mind is that there are many different models of communication. So in this lecture, we're looking to consolidate and present models conceptually rather than prescriptively. What this means is rather than talking to each individual specific model, what I have done is try to put them together in their more sort of quality sense rather than the prescriptive sense, more as what the idea that the model is focusing on rather than the specifics of that particular model. So the first model we're going to look at is the idea of communication as transmission. This implies that the primary purpose of communication is to deliver messages, the movement of data from one individual to another or from one institution to an audience. Transmission models also assume that at some point reception takes place. So data is sent out and then it's received, and that's that. Now in terms of data here, it could be a thought, an instruction, a wish, an idea, or a feeling. Now the problem with the transmission model is that it's very simplistic, and the fact that it's linear becomes problematic in terms of understanding the full complexity of communication. Material produced and circulated by the media is what we most commonly understand as the transmission model. The process that is dominated by the source, in this case the media institutions, and this is now increasingly being challenged by digital media. So transmission model, the main problem with it is that it does not take into account the complexity of communication and the fact that it reduces communication to a single linear perspective means that it cannot account for then what happens after transmission and reception happens. Now the most common and best model in trying to understand this is the Shannon-Weaver model. Now Shannon-Weaver were not communication practitioners, they were actually engineers. So the way they understood communication is that there was a sender who encoded a message and it was sent out across a medium, and sometimes this medium had noise and there was different types of noises. It went into a decoder and then it was received, and that was the Shannon-Weaver or the communication as transmission model. Now if we up the complexity a little bit, we look at communication as exchange. In this model, there is no monopoly on who is the sender. The reply from the receiver then creates the communication as an exchange. As such, there is constant exchange within and between communities, exchange of words, images, signs, and gestures. Whether this communication is intentional or not, all communication must be accompanied by some kind of impact. What this says is that now when the message is transmitted and upon when received, replied to, this creates the exchange, and we cannot help but continually exchange information whether we liked it or not. So here we take the Shannon-Weaver model and we add a feedback loop. So when the sender sends a message across the medium to the receiver then provides feedback, or the model works backwards and forwards. So there's an increased complexity in the way we think about communication there. The next model is the model of communication of meaning. Here it is moving beyond the mechanics and the processes of communication to start looking at the why and the purpose of communications. This is using theories like semiotics to analyze communication. In the communication of meaning, there are formal symbols of communication such as language, but also informal communication such as gesture. Here, when we are engaging in communication, we have to take into consideration the context in which the communication is taking place, the literacies of the people communicating, the locations from where the people are communicating, as well as the power relations and so on and so forth between the various people that are engaging in the communication. Now, a really useful model of thinking of communication as meaning, communication of meaning, unlike the Laswell model. And here it's quite useful to think about who says what, in what channel, to whom, with what effect. So who, being the communicator, who is in control, sends a message, and that tends to be the content. And the channel would be the medium it will be sent in, to whom will be the receiver or the audience, and with what effect will be the impact on the person. So this model, where we look at who says what, in what channel, to whom, with what effect, is a really useful way to think about when designing communication, in particularly looking to focus on the impact and the way meaning will be perceived by the audience. Communication as discourse. This is another way of thinking about communication where we focus on meaningful and coherent expressions of ideas, and in particular ideas that are the expression of a particular ideological position. Here we say that every message within the range of meaning, and these range of meanings then constrain the meanings. Now this is a slightly more complex way of thinking about communication. Now, while most of the time we tend to think as, and we find useful, the model of communication of meaning, communication discourse takes it a little bit further by putting in the notion of ideology. So here we look at how that model works. Every object out there creates a text. Every object out there is a piece of text. And this collection of text then work within themselves, intertextuality, to create a discourse. Basically thinking about what is being distilled up from all the different things that are being said. And this tends to create an ideology, which is a dominant or hegemonic way of thinking about things. We will explore these ideas further in another lecture. At the end, we have to think about communication as not only transmission, it is also reception and response. However, any real theory of communication is also a theory of community. Raymond Williams makes this quite explicit, and it is a really important thing to keep in mind. We're not only talking about transmission of information, we're not only talking about reception and then response, but we're also talking about the role that a community plays in communication. It is very difficult to think clearly about communication because the pattern of our thinking about community is normally dominative. Communication becomes a science of penetrating the mass mind and of registering an impact there. It is not easy to think along different lines. What Williams is talking about here is the fact that communication has a dominant meaning, and this dominant meaning is very much linked to the community in which this communication is taking place. As such, it is very hard to open up our minds to think in different ways. Some of the questions to consider at the end of the lecture. Using narrative language, describe how each of these models move information from start to end. What are the strengths and weaknesses of each model? What communication technologies can be best used to explain each model and why? Thank you for listening.